How would you define democracy? Voting? A government of, by, and for the people? Majority rules, 3 wolves and a sheep choosing what's for dinner? I ask because most people think democracy is important, and most people think it's voting. I think democracy is important because I want to have some sort of say into the decisions and issues that impact my life. In fact, I've spent the last couple of years trying to explore this question of what democracy is and what it means to different people. And it's brought me all around the world. In Japan, I had the opportunity to meet a bunch of high school students. The Japanese culture is very structured, very respectful of rules and discipline. And so it came as no surprise that the high school students said to me, well, democracy is getting to decide who makes the rules. It made a lot of sense. When I went to Brussels, I had the opportunity to talk to a member of the European Parliament. And he said to me, Jesse, democracy cannot be done by leaders alone. Real people need to get involved and go vote. Again, not particularly surprising. This is coming from Europe, the grandmother of Western civilization. But then I went to Tunisia, and I had the opportunity to talk to a young Tunisian activist who had been involved in the Arab Spring. Of course, they don't call it the Arab Spring there, they call it the revolution. And she said that democracy is having more than the same choice during each election. She said democracy is the ability to have a voice at the table. And we connected because her country had a revolution in 2011, my country had a revolution in 1776, and we agreed that the struggle for democracy is never ending. It's a struggle that never ends. You never win it, not with elections, not with revolutions. It's never won. And of course, this stuck with me because when I went around the United States trying to learn what people thought of democracy, you know, America's had a rough go these last few years from a democracy standpoint, so the responses weren't as surprising to me as maybe they would be to others, but people said, our votes mean nothing. The system is broken. My personal favorite, democracy is the choice between the lesser of 2 evils. And that's when it struck me that every time we talk about democracy in the West, we talk about voting, as if it's the end-all, be-all solution to claiming our power, to claiming our democracy, to changing the world for the world that we want. And I guess that really stuck with me when I had a conversation with a woman named Bongi. Bongi was 17 years old when she got arrested in South Africa for her role in the anti-apartheid struggle at 17. And she told the extraordinary story of the community movements that had led to the overthrow of the apartheid regime. And so it was a great story of people's power, but it was also a very strong story about how important it is to sustain engagement over a period of time. It took years to overthrow apartheid. It didn't happen overnight. But she also told us how critical it was to keep the pressure on after they had elected Nelson Mandela into power. In fact, that's where many have argued they failed. It might surprise you that over the last 20 years, inequality has not changed that much in South Africa. And that's when it occurred to me. It's when we stop engaging that we lose our power. And if you think about it, what they had done is they got very excited. They organized their community movements and overthrew apartheid. They elected the African National Congress and Nelson Mandela, a historical milestone. And over time, that movement, that organized pressure, died out. And if you think about it, South Africans aren't the only ones guilty of this. We do this all the time. We do this in the West, we do this in the United States, we do this around the world. We get ourselves, tell me you haven't done this before. Election's coming up, you're very excited about a campaign, very excited about the candidate, you tell your friends about it, your neighbors, your family, you share it on Facebook, maybe you donate in a fundraiser. Then the election day comes around and it's time to vote for your guy or gal, and they win or lose, and then you stop. And then we wonder why we don't get what we'd like out of them. And so the question becomes, if we're not putting the pressure on them after the election, then who is? Well, we know who is. We know that a Princeton Northwestern study came out about 1.5 years ago that says that the United States is actually an oligarchy, not a democracy. An oligarchy meaning where there's a very small few of people who have the power and influence. And again, no one's surprised by this study. 76% of Americans think that the minimum wage should be increased. 77% think that we should invest in an infrastructure program, putting people back to work, building our roads and bridges. Now, have we seen any progress on these issues? No. But we also haven't organized pressure around it either, at least not in the same way that people recently organized pressure around that Indiana Religious Freedom Bill. People put the pressure on there and won. And that leads me to the big idea today. We have to stop telling ourselves and our students that democracy is voting in some election every 2 to 4 years. This is a civic duty, but it's not democracy. Let's redefine democracy as what happens in between elections, as the ability for us to influence the organizations, the issues, decisions that impact our lives and our communities. And so that means it's not just for government, it's not just for a federal election, it's for all of the communities and organizations in our life. Our schools, our community organizations, our nonprofits, our charities, and yes, our workplace. Now, of course, if we were to redefine democracy in this way, the campaigners and pundits would be quick to double down on what they already tell you today, which is that the most important ways to reclaim our democracy are to fix voter ID laws, or to get out the vote and increase voter registration, or to campaign finance reform, or ending the negative ads, or understanding the candidates' platforms. Now, of course, these are all important issues, but they're based on a fundamental assumption that the center of power is in the election. And so, if we redefine democracy as what happens in between elections, we redefine and acknowledge where the power really is, with the people, not with campaign dollars, not with votes, but with real people. And so, of course, in this way of looking at democracy, what do elections become? Elections become a mechanism for accountability, for leadership accountability, not as a handover of power, but rather a way of keeping our leaders accountable to the voice of the people, to the pressure that we leverage on them in between elections. Now, don't get me wrong. Open and free elections are crucial to any democracy. But in this model, we can realize that we have power in between the elections as well. So what stands in our way? Well, the number one thing, of course, is time. In your average work week, work, family, friends, maybe a little bit of self-entertainment if we can squeeze it in. If Jack and Jane are going to be involved in between the elections, it better be simple, it better be meaningful, it better be valuable, and it better be flexible, because they just don't have the time. And that's what leads me to my second point. If we redefine democracy as what happens in between elections, then we also need to purposely commit to building and adopting the leadership practices, the infrastructure, the tools, the engagement culture to engage in between those elections. Now, this is important for three primary reasons. The first is that people are already gaining a sense of engagement and participation in other areas of their life, right? We can Yelp a restaurant. We can Airbnb a room. We can Uber a taxi. We can Angie a babysitter, right? There's a sense of participation and engagement. But when it comes to government and our community organizations, that isn't there. And so this participation, I'm arguing, is becoming less of an option and more of a requirement because there's an expectation there. The second thing is that engagement is always crucial to maintaining the democracy. It's when engagement decreases when we see the oligarchy arise. And so engaging is the only way to sustain the democracy. Third, and this is really important, really relevant given these times, we're seeing how important it is to make sure that we don't let the gap between leaders and communities get any wider. All over the world, certainly all over the country, we're seeing example after example after example of gaps between leaders and communities. Watching the recent Baltimore riots was like watching Mad Max on CNN. And then it's because, among many other reasons, there's a gap between leaders and communities. So this gap needs to be addressed, because with that gap comes a striking sense of a lack of accountability. And with a lack of accountability, we can't have trust. If we can't have trust, engagement goes down, power consolidates to a few, the oligarchy arises, and in some cases, institutions crumble altogether. So, what do we need to actually create this sort of enabling infrastructure for engagement in between elections? Well, the first is an understanding. And that understanding is that power does not come from being in a position over people. It comes from being connected with people. In the 21st century, in this ultra age of connectedness, power comes from being connected with people, being able to influence them and organize action. This is people's power. Now, this has profound implications for leaders of all kinds, but it also has implications for us, just as community members. We have to recognize that we have this power as well, not just during elections, but in between them as well. We have the power to self-organize. We have the power to stand up. Right now, we could all go outside and protest on anything that we wanted. That's what freedom of assembly allows us to do. That's what freedom of speech allows us to do. We can do that. I have a friend of mine, Bridget, from New Zealand. She said to me, Jesse, if we want to discuss an issue, we can call a town hall meeting ourselves. That's people's power. You can have 25 of your friends, give public notice, the mayor's required to attend. That's amazing. But so that requires an attitude of experimentation, right? It requires a willingness to participate in these experiments, not just as community members, but as leaders as well. And so this is crucial to being able to understand that. Now, of course, leaders and organizations need the infrastructure to support this type of people's power, this type of self-organizing. And at Powerline, we've been working the last couple of years to understand exactly what that infrastructure is and working to build it and deliver it as well. And we've come across 3 critical rules that we think are important to any community that's looking to build people's power. The first is that any infrastructure must support a broad spectrum of engagement. Now, what do I mean by this? Traditionally, we've had transactional engagement. Maybe you pay dues once a year, you get a newsletter, pay a fundraiser, vote in an election once every couple of years. That's very transactional. A broad spectrum of engagement produces additional involvement opportunities. This may be an opportunity to participate in space and dialogue. It may be an opportunity to be part of a shared decision-making process, a broad spectrum of engagement. Now, in this broad spectrum of engagement, rule 2 would be that this engagement supports the concept of leadership, not just mayors and presidents of unions and directors of organizations, but also organic leadership. And a good way to think about this is with an open feedback loop. Open not in the sense that it's open-ended, but open that anyone can participate in a feedback loop and anyone can create it. Okay, so that broad spectrum of engagement should support these open feedback loops and support the concept of leadership. The third rule is to make sure that we avoid the illusion of democracy, and this is important. It's very easy to be tricked as either leaders or community members into participating in some sort of PR check-the-box engagement activity. Even right now, you may be familiar. Democrats.org send out a petition to increase the minimum wage. Republicans send out a petition to decrease taxes. You go to sign that petition. Do you realize that you're actually signing an opt-in form of advertising? You're adding yourself to a mailing list that's going to be used to fundraise. It's not a petition that's being delivered to someone. That's an illusion of democracy. And so we need to be very careful that we sustain true, honest, very authentic engagement in order to make sure that we don't lose that trust, because without the trust, the engagement will decrease. With these 3 rules, the infrastructure supports the engagement between elections. Now, ultimately, we have to remember that the currency of change is social pressure. Not votes, not dollars. Social pressure. And we must remember that the struggle for democracy never ends. As such, we must make a commitment ourselves to being involved in the world beyond work, family, and friends if we are to make the world a better place and avoid a Mad Max future. Now, of course, there's going to be voices that say, it's not worth it. It's not worth my time. It's too stressful. They'll never change. We must ignore those voices. We must look past those voices and find the voice that says, I need to be engaged. I need to take responsibility to make the world a better place for myself, for my children, for my family, for my community. I need to find that voice. Now, there will be those who call you a dreamer. But as John Lennon would say, you're not the only one. Just imagine the possibilities. Imagine the possibilities for your organization, for your school, for your workplace, for your family, for your world, for our world. You can do this. We can do this. So how will you define democracy? It's what happens in between elections. It's going to take the right infrastructure, it's going to take the right leadership, it's going to take the right commitment to engagement. But when we do this, we will claim our people's power, and we'll change the world for the world we want and for the world we need. And that's an idea worth spreading. Thank you very much.